Welcome back to Tanya in 5. Today, we're going to recap letter 20 in book 4 of Tanya, Iggeret HaKodesh. This letter is one of the longer ones and very deep in terms of the mystical, Kabbalistic explanations offered. Here in our recap, we're not going to go through all the technical, mystical, geographic levels described in this letter, but rather we're going to focus on what's the objective, what does the Alter Rebbe want with this letter, what does he want us to understand. Now essentially, the Alter Rebbe is addressing the question of the value of mitzvahs that are done with physical objects. That's the ultimate objective of this letter. Now, as to why there is such emphasis placed on the performance of mitzvahs with the physical objects, many different explanations are offered in Chassidus, and in this letter the following explanation is offered. There are two ways in which things come into being. The first is known in Hebrew, in Chassidic terminology, as Ilah v'Alol, which means cause and effect. It's a loose translation. Let's just use by way of analogy an idea that's in my mind, which then bears out an emotion. So there's the cause, the ilah, the idea, and then there's the effect, the alol, the emotion. Now there's a direct link between the cause and the effect. We can draw a direct line from my emotion to the idea. In fact, in some ways, the emotion already exists, at least in some potentiality, within the idea. This idea has the potential, or will inevitably, bear out such and such an emotion. And even as I experience that emotion, it is very much attached to the ideas that bore it. So there's a direct correlation between the cause and effect, in that the cause is really just the potential for the effect, and the effect, even as it exists, is directly attached to the cause. Now, this is true especially in the spiritual world. Every spiritual being, if it were to create something, it would bring out just the next step of some sort of spiritual evolution. One level of spirituality bears out the next level of spirituality. Maybe that level is a little lower, but still directly linked to the level from which it emerged. And so it is in the chain of spiritual evolution, one level to another level to another level to another level, but there's a direct line and a relationship and a direct link from one level to the level before it, to the level before it, and so on and so forth. And thus, from purely spiritual energy, there can never emerge physical matter, because there is no link between physicality and spirituality. So if spirituality is left to evolve, where one cause leads to an effect, and then that becomes the cause for the next effect, and that becomes the cause for the next effect, and so on and so forth, it'll create endless spiritual levels, but all remain spiritual. Because there must be a relationship between cause and effect. So that's all the first way in which something is born out. The next manner in which something is born out is what's known in Hasidic terminology in Hebrew as yesh me'ayin, which means something from nothing. Our world is created something from nothing. Prior to our world, there was nothing. But hold on a second. There was nothing? God was here. So what do you mean there was nothing before creation? Well, what we mean is that there was no matter with which creation was made. Or another way of putting this is, creation, the physical matter, has no way of describing the source from which it comes. We have no comprehension of our source. God, his very essence, brings about this whole being called creation, and yet we cannot say anything of God and say, oh, well, this is how God led to this creation. In cause and effect, we can say, yes, this cause, the potentiality for this effect, and this effect is directly linked to that cause. But when it comes to creation, prior to creation, there are no conditions under which creation makes sense. It's not as if God had a bunch of materials and then constructed a world. There was nothing. Not because nothing existed. God existed. But that which existed, that which precedes creation, has no relationship to creation. There's an infinite chasm between creator and creation. There's no direct link as it is with cause and effect. Now, this capacity to create something that's an absolute otherness, that has no relationship to the Creator, only God can do that. Divine great spiritual entities can evolve to other spiritual entities, and to other spiritual entities, and to other spiritual levels, but they will never create an otherness that sees itself as independent. It will never create something from nothing. Only God Himself has the capacity to create something that sees itself as completely detached from its source, from God Himself, as if a something from nothing. Now, the Alter Rebbe tells us that this is why the most physical of all matter, the earth itself, has this model. When you take a seed and you plant it in the ground and then a tree emerges, in some sense that tree emerged from nothing, because the seed and the tree have no relationship. It's not as if seeds, if they evolve and get bigger, they become a tree. They just become bigger seeds. Seeds need to rot, and then from the earth sprouts forth a tree. It's almost as if that which emerged, the tree, has zero relationship from the place from which it came, a something from nothing. And therefore, concludes the Alter Rebbe, mitzvahs done with physical matter have such great value, because a spiritual relationship with God developed through Torah, or even a spiritual relationship with God that exists in the spiritual realms, are limited to being whatever spiritual level it so happens to be that we comprehend. But physical matter has that divine essence that can create an otherness. Only God Himself, as I said before, has the capacity to create an other entity that sees itself as completely separate from God. So when we do a mitzvah with the physical matter, and this physical matter seems to be completely detached from God, in essence, embedded in that physical matter is the deepest truth of God, that only He can create physical matter that sees itself as independent. And thus, when we do a mitzvah, we are attaching ourselves and connecting to a very deep, essential level of God that's capable of creating an absolute otherness, a reality that sees itself as independent from its source. The takeaway from all of this is, we should consider that every physical object we interact with, was chosen by God Himself to be created. And embedded in that physical matter, in that physical object, is a creative capacity that only God's very deep essence has, beyond anything spiritual, beyond any spiritual level. And therefore we ought to ask ourselves, am I treating that object the way the Creator, whose essence is invested in that object, wants me to interact with that object? Am I using the object in such a way that makes the Creator proud of the object? Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude Letter 21.